This video will not only explain what the recently featured Black Nika represents, but also what the role of Blackbeard is, what the role of Luffy is, what Nika is an allegory to, who Imu is, how One Piece will end, and much more. Welcome to the Esoteric Guide of One Piece. The resolution of One Piece has been obvious for those who understand its esoteric influences for a long time. I will say it outright. One Piece is agnostic, kabbalistic, biblical allegory, like nearly every great work of fiction from the past few decades. A Song of Ice and Fire, Dune, Metropolis, Matrix, The Truman Show, and so on. Berserk, Naruto, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, and most other games developed by From Software serve as examples of Gnostic stories written by Japanese authors. If you think I am delusional, please allow me to substantiate this big claim. The reason why Blackbeard and Luffy parallel each other as their inversions is that they both embody related archetypes. They are, respectively, Antichrist and Christ. In the archetypal sense, both Christ and the Antichrist present themselves as a Messiah, a man who will bring great change to the world. However, one archetype chooses to destroy the world, bring forth the apocalypse, while the other chooses to redeem it, to rebuild the world. Both are equated with the sun and thus call upon the dawn. Lucifer literally means light bringer, after all. Luffy is the one who will bring the dawn, but as an allegorical Christ. Yes, the D stands for the dawn. The D clan is said to be the enemy of God because they oppose the false god, the Antichrist. They are potential kings among kings. Though in Blackbeard's case, the D gets a double meaning. It stands for darkness, for he represents the dark sun, the eclipsed sun. Just to make things clear, the Black Nika is the perception some children have of this bringer of dawn, who can either be a force for good or for evil. Blackbeard stands for this dark Nika. His fight with Luffy will be a clash of wills. Luffy will have to overpower him through haki alone, as was foreshadowed by Kaido's dialogue about true power. Blackbeard's Dark Devil Fruit will awaken and neuter Nika's fruit, forcing him to rely on his haki. And as most of you surely know, haki means will. Luffy will prove he is the most fitting to conquer the world. Blackbeard's haki will be much inferior to his, for as is above, so is below. Their journeys have inversely mirrored each other's, with Luffy always doing things the right way, facing his challenges head-on, and Blackbeard avoiding having to prove his valor at every turn. Luffy will prove to be the King of Kings, a title claimed by Jesus Christ himself. This is why some people in universe think of Nika as a bringer of destruction and relate him to the apocalypse, while others perceive him as their savior. He can be both, and he is both. Luffy, as Nika, will destroy and rebuild the world. Blackbeard would, if he were to be the story's protagonist, destroy the world and bring upon it the dusk, a dark age where he would rule as a supreme dictator under a law of might, just like how Hachinosu operates under him. If he were to win, he'd be a pimp among pimps. Imu is an archetypal antichrist as well, and he won against his generation's Christ. He has become the ruler of the entire world and created a false paradise on Earth. He is the demiurge of One Piece. This is also why he seems to be inspired by Nero, the archetypal antichrist alluded to in the Bible who pursued Christians, like Imu pursues the members of the D clan. The Antichrist is often related to the alchemical Rebis, the perfect being. This means that Imu will most likely have the Western Dragon Devil Fruit, and as is often the case as well, the dragon in question will be allegorical to Satan. The one who leads the Celestial Dragons will have the fruit of the Celestial Dragon, the fallen angel, a dragon who rules the earth. Imu's dragon form will have a devil's tail, as was hinted by his confrontation with Sabo. The symbol of the world government represents the four cardinal directions, the four corners of the earth, united under the Antichrist, the center point. And Imu's throne is a reference to the layout of the Vatican, the so-called Holy Land of our world. I will avoid discussing the implications of that. Luffy's straw hat represents the sun, which is why Joy Boy's straw hat, a gigantic version of Luffy's, for Joy Boy was likely a buccaneer, a man-giant hybrid, is frozen. That serves as a display of his defeat by Imu. His sun was extinguished. All the newly introduced antagonists, from the Gorosei onwards, are blatantly satanic, can transform into demons, and teletransport through pentagrams, the number 5 being a reference to the emblem of the world government, which is like the order of the Gorosei itself. Shamrock's sword is a Cerberus, the beast who guards the gates of the underworld, and Gunko's fruit represents the coercive powers of the corrupt empire. She manifests literal arrows that can both strike her foes with unavoidable attacks, as well as commands them through mind control. Though not even her powers can convince Loki to surrender his soul to the demonic, for he is like Luffy, a conqueror among conquerors. Figarland Garling's design is particularly interesting. He represents the moon to Imu's sun. The moon reflects the light of the sun, and Garling will be his right-hand man. Or rather, his left-hand man, if you know what I mean. He doesn't just represent any moon, however. He represents the blood moon, which is, esoterically, a reference to the Antichrist, to the alchemical Rebis, the perfect being who embodies the opposites as one. The Celestial Dragons, a title meaning, esoterically, satanic rulers of the earthly paradise of the Antichrist, derive from families that have made a deal with the devil's son, with Imu, the Antichrist, and so have been marked with his seal, the mark of the beast, which is likely inherited through genetics, explaining the inbreeding that goes on in the false paradise that is Mary Joa. By the way, the name of the false paradise references, in a derogatory way, the Virgin Mary, who in One Piece will be portrayed allegorically as Imu's mother. It means the jealousy of Mary. It was probably Mary's wish to unite the world under benevolent rule, a wish Imu twisted and then made happen. Luffy's fight against the Five Elders is emblematic of the Gnostic undertones of the series. Christ faces the 5 Archons who administer the earthly world in a location that is an allegory to the Simulacrum, a virtual world that Luffy tears down as he battles against its masters. There is a myriad of other scenes that are subtly charged with esoteric subtexts, such as this one where a member of the D-Clan, Jaguar D. Sol, defeats a giant serpent with a punch he calls Final Exorcization, or, more accurately, demonic purification. For another recent example, in this scene, Gaban fights Luffy over a presumably golden key that's adorned with a crown. He is testing Luffy to see if he is worthy of bringing the Benevolence Dawn, like the man Roger was waiting for. And to conclude this section, I'll point out an interesting detail regarding the God's Knights. They seem to have the habit of making a game out of everything, in reference, again, to the simulacrum-like nature of the material world that is presided over by the Demiurge. They view other humanoids as golems, who exist only to serve them. Yes, it is obvious by this point that the One Piece is simply the world united as one. Everyone will fight under Christ to defeat Satan, and that is the One Piece. I know there is an old theory that proposes that the One Piece is simply an interconnected world, and I believe it's to be correct. The world will indeed become connected physically and spiritually as the dawn is cast upon it by Luffy. This theory explains why the story was baiting us into thinking Loki might be evil. He represents either the archetypal Christ or the archetypal Antichrist, as Luffy and Blackbeard, and Oda is essentially making us bet into whether he is Christ or Antichrist. Oda chose to base his character on a rogue deity of Norse myth for this reason. I will say though that he is quite obviously a Christ, while his father is most definitely an Antichrist. Those archetypes are often presented, superficially, as their opposite. Think of Guts, the Christ archetype who is represented by a beast of darkness, and Griffith, the Antichrist archetype who is represented by a falcon of light. The Antichrist fools mankind into believing he is Christ, which is why the majority of people believe the world governments to be a force of good. Loki presents himself as evil, though he is, internally, good. His father, who removed his demonic-looking horns, presented himself as good, though he was internally evil. He was probably ordered by the Celestial Dragons to appease the warriors of Elbaf, who were a force of resistance against Imu's empire. As Shamrock puts it, the warriors of Elbaf dominate the world, and the world government wants to bring them to heel no matter what. They were likely expansionistic in an effort to liberate other nations by force. which is not unlike what Luffy did throughout the story. Mother Caramel's infiltration was also an instance of the world government attempting to neuter Elbaf's strength, but she wasn't as effective as King Harald. She is inspired by Madre Teresa, a highly corrupt holy woman, and her name, Caramel, is a nod to the idea of luring kids with sweets to kidnap them. The Giants are the final piece to Luffy's forces. They will determine the success of the rebellion against the false god. Just as Loki is being offered to become a celestial dragon if he were to follow the orders of the god's knights, his father was as well, and Loki possibly killed him for his betrayal in a state of possession by his fruit. Of course, Oda relates all of this to Norse myth, instead of relegating it to biblical symbolism and allegory. Loki's superficially destructive dawn is equated to the Ragnarok. Luffy's dawn will be partially destructive as well, as it always is for the kingdoms he unshackles. Think of Dressrosa, which Luffy ruined by defeating that country's malefic ruler. The Flamingo was a master manipulator whose devil fruit power was to control people with puppet strings, and who ended up oppressing his kingdom with a literal birdcage made from such puppet strings. A cage Luffy destroys alongside the kingdom, a microcosmic foreshadowing of what he will do to the macrocosm. A new world will be born from this mayhem. Ordo ab chaos, order will be born out of chaos. The Red Line, the great red dragon, will be torn to shreds, and the seas will be restored into the fabled All Blue. The Legend of the Three Worlds is a puzzle that holds the key to the past and future events of One Piece. The first world mentions the destruction caused by Imu, and his ascension to the throne. The second world mentions Joy Boy's arrival, and his failure to defeat Imu. And the third world refers to the dawn Luffy will bring. I predict this arc will feature a montage of the people of Elbaf training to become stronger warriors, going against their previous king's malicious wishes. And that the elder Jarul, the only giant who knows the truth besides Loki himself, will become its ruler. Oda will turn his coronation into a gag, involving the sword that is stuck on his helmet. To conclude this section of the video, I will point out that the majority of the major antagonists are microcosmic allegories to the Antichrist. Some are more blatant in their role than others. Think of Enel, Doflamingo, and Kaido, who transforms into a literal dragon, though an eastern one. To spice things up with an unorthodox example, Crocodile wants nature itself to obey him, to conquer the earthly world, and his name is that of a reptile, a dragon-like animal. He is like a miniature, foolish emu. I will now speak about what I believe will be both Kid's and Law's roles in the story going forward. Think about it logically. Why did both Law and Kid seemingly lose their crews, or at the very least got crushed by Yonko, simultaneously, right at the start of the final saga? What does that mean to the overarching narrative? The Cross Guild has Mihawk and Crocodile, sure, but it still feels bare bones in comparison to a proper endgame threat. Zoro will fight Mihawk, yes, but how will that happen? And if the Cross Guild will indeed clash against the Straw Hats, who would fight Luffy? Buggy again? No. I think the rivalry between him and Kid will finally be paid off through the Cross Guild as well. Just like Zoro and Mihawk had their fight foreshadowed for the endgame of the story, there were various hints that Luffy and Kid would face off against each other in a major fight somewhere near the end of the story. And how will that happen? I doubt there would be a great deal of animosity between the Straw Hats and the Cross Guild. Mihawk is Zoro's master, and both Boogie and Crocodile are in good terms with Luffy since Marineford. Kid isn't one of Luffy's enemies, but his rival. Law, of course, is Luffy's friend. The Cross Guild is seeking the One Piece. Kid's crew, Killer accepted, is made of a bunch of bums, just like Law's. The fights could happen in a game, a Davy Back fight to be specific, especially considering how I believe Boogie's crew, the Cross Guild, will parallel Rocks. Both would, if this theory is correct, feature multiple Conqueror Haki users, who don't exactly work as subordinates of their so-called leader. Kid will want to seek the One Piece for himself, and Law will pursue his own goals. Both will walk alongside Boogie, the accidental contender for the throne, who represents the moon, the celestial body that parasitically absorbs the light of the sun. His blue hair is akin to a lion's mantle, So how will Kid face Luffy, being as weak as he seems to be? I believe Kid will get a major upgrade in strength once he comes back to the story. At the beginning of Wano, Luffy got defeated in one hit by a Yonko, but after he learned Advanced Conquerors he managed to defeat that very Yonko that could one-shot him just days before. We know Kid has Conqueror's Haki, yet he never really used it. To me, the writing is on the wall. Kid will learn Advanced Conquerors and become a true top-tier character, finally fits to be Luffy's rival. It's possible, even, that his Haki bloom will conversely parallel Luffy's Devil Fruit awakening, with both having been the result of a crushing defeat to a Yonko that nearly kills them. Jarul Mihawk is related to Emu by blood. His second name, Jarul, is a reference to an archetypal antichrist of our world. The historical figure who inspires Dracula, Vlad Tepes, the man whose father belongs to the Satanic secret society Order of the Dragon, which was what earned him his moniker, Dracul, is the inspiration for Mihawk's character. Mihawk distinctly bears Emu's peculiar eyes. His hawk eyes were, in fact, originally those of a dragon. The hawk, or the falcon, is often esoterically linked to the dragon. This is also why he rules over an island of monkeys, who represents the foolish humans who live under the simulacrum of the Antichrist, and why his weapon is a black cross, a blatant symbol of the Antichrist. He is characterized as having the personality of an arrogant, but elegant, collected noble, like some of the high-ranking celestial dragons. The serpent's deity of Skypiea doesn't represent Nika, but Emu. It represents the false god of the sun, the deceiver, which is why it demands human sacrifices like a demiurge-type controller. The Great Cleansing alluded to by the Gorosei is a reference to the flood of the Old Testament. Emu is the demiurge, the vengeful, jealous god of the Old Testament, who enacts severe punishments upon his subjects. To finally conclude this video, I will briefly speak about what Ace's execution, one of One Piece's most esoterically charged sequences, represents. Ace was a false messiah, a false Christ, a false son. The symbolic ace, as in the card, of those who seek to rebel. He rejected his predestined role due to his Luciferian, freedom-seeking spirit. Whitebeard, yet another esoteric moon, believed him to be the one who'd call upon the dawn. They complemented each other as sun and moon. Emu thought Ace was the one predestined to overthrow him, which is a secondary, esoteric reason for him choosing to stream his execution for the whole world to see. Blackbeard, yet another false son, the bringer of darkness, was the one who offered him to Emu as a sacrifice for his own ascension. Their fight represents the Nigredo, the darkening of the sun. Ace was successfully rescued by his family and friends, but his prideful nature, pride being the sin of Lucifer, the Lightbringer, caused his unexpected death. His design reflects his dualistic nature. His hat is adorned by two contrasting faces, and it holds a talisman that depicts the skull of a devil.